Hey friends, my name is Andre, and this is the Tennis and Bagels podcast. This is a podcast about everything tennis, various topics from recreational to pro. And today is a really cool, special day for me for this podcast. And we have Vansh is coming back here, and you guys know him, writer at Cracked Rackets and Tennis Fanatic. And the special guest that we have today, a person that has so much experience in the game and so much to bring in, and I'm sure that this time is going to be amazing with him around. And this guy is Steve Flink, and he is a tennis journalist and writer for a very long time, writing about tennis, at least about 4 or 5 decades. And he wrote for World Tennis Magazine, Tennis Week, and Tennis Channel. He's a Hall of Famer. That's right, the same one that has in Newport. And he's also a tennis historian who wrote also 2 reputable monographs, The Great Tennis Matches of the 20th Century and The Greatest Tennis Matches of All Time. And he has a 3rd book coming out really soon about Pete Sampras, one of my favorite tennis players of all time in the 90s. And the book's called Pete Sampras Greatness Revised, and it's coming out really soon. Hi, Steve, how are you doing?
Good. Let me just give you, if you don't mind, it's actually the Pete Sampras Greatness Revisited.
Revisited. I actually have it written correctly.
Yeah, no,
but yeah.
But anyway, great to be with you. Delighted to be on the podcast.
Amazing. And when is it coming out?
That book
exactly.
1st of September is the official release
Amazing.
date. So during the U.S. Open, good timing because that's the 30th anniversary of his becoming the youngest man ever at 19 years and 28 days old back in 1990 when he won his first of 5 U.S. Opens.
That's great. And Vansh, how's it going?
Great. Thanks again, Andre, for having me here. And today is a really special episode, and absolutely delighted that we have one of my favorite all-time historians and someone who I look up to immensely, and I'm fortunate to be discussing the greatest seasons in the Open era.
Cool. And yeah, for the audience, the little thing is I'm also really delighted to be here, and I might be a little nervous. You might notice that in my voice a few times from time to time. Let's get this started. First of all, it's the best seasons of all time. We're not really diving into as much of how impressive their careers entirely were, but really focusing on a single season. And there are several incredible players, also specifically speaking from the ATP Tour. Hopefully at some point we're going to I'm going to get to be doing the WTA as well, which has incredible players of all time as well. But we're going to be touching on specific players in specific seasons. I'm just going to name them out here immediately so that you know. We're going to be talking about Vilas, Guillermo Vilas 1977 season, John McEnroe 1984 season, Andre Agassi 1999 season, and Roger Federer 2006 season, with the help of Vansh and Steve. And let's start with Vilas. So I guess just giving some context because of maybe for the younger audiences. So what was the game like back in the 70s, in the late 70s? For maybe Steve, who has a little bit more experience on that one.
Well, there's a lot of diversity in the game at that time. I mean, you had Connors, who was really in the midst of 5 years in a row at number 1, and he was a great all-court player, hit the ball flat out both sides. Borg had emerged in kind of a really sort of a transformational figure in the game with his heavy topspin and his two-handed backhand. Connors with the two-hander as well, but more conventional, straight back, hit straight through the ball. Bjorn had all that loop. So you had Borg and Connors in the forefront. John Newcomb in the mid-70s was still a great, from Australia, the classic serve and volley. There were a lot of great players at that time with different playing styles. But I think that Vilas sort of emerged in this. He was a rival of Borg's, and he always had to deal with the specter of Borg, which was not easy because they played the game in such a similar way with heavy topspin on both sides, and Borg was just almost always better at it. So Borg was something of a nemesis for Vilas, but Vilas, by the time we're talking about with the 77 season, had done some hard work on his game, and he's from Argentina, but he developed a great slice backhand, had a nice temperament, very driven, and this was really the sort of the culmination of his career in '77.
Nice. So I guess, Vansh, you have something to add there?
Yeah, I mean, so just more specifically on Vilas, I mean, a lot of people talk about his clay court resume and his clay court all-time records, and his clay court CV is absolutely remarkable, especially we're talking about this season in particular in 1977, where he played one of the most dominant French Opens, certainly that I can recall in the Open era. Would that be fair to say?
That's very fair to say. And of course, to beat Gottfried Love 3 and Love in the final was sort of proof of what you're saying. And he was really on. The draw was right for him. It wasn't one of the tougher fields he'd had to deal with in various ways. But the way that Vilas was playing that year, it wouldn't have mattered much unless he'd had to face Borg. I don't think he was going to lose to anybody else at Roland Garros, for instance. And then it was really Roland Garros that launched him through the season. He wanted that title so badly, and he got it. And then he just kept going right through the summers and won the U.S. Open when it was also on clay. It was actually technically Hartrue, which is a great green comp, is very similar to clay, comes under the category clay. And that was a big win for him that sort of capped it all off when he beat Connors in the U.S. Open final, because he was really unbeaten through that whole stretch, and he won that 44 matches in a row, 46 in a row. It was really unstoppable from the French through the U.S. Opens, and 2 majors, and just a phenomenal season all around, and well-deserved given the work that he put in to sort of set that path ahead.
A little bit more about Vilas. I just wanted to ask Steve about this. Since he grew up, obviously you mentioned his record over Connors was a little bit better than it was against Borg. He certainly seemed to match up better against Connors. But just a little bit more about kind of their public image and persona during this times. How did fans really identify with Vilas during his prime period in '77? Let's say compared to maybe the ice cold Bjorn or Connors, who definitely wore his heart on his sleeve, but was nasty at times on the court, and just different reputations. How would you kind of compare those?
He was closer. It's a good question. He's closer to Borg than he was to Connors in the sense of how he comported himself. He had there was a little bit more personality, a little bit more dynamic qualities, but he was very well behaved on the court, and no nonsense kind of a guy. Very philosophical, maybe a deeper thinker than Bjorn, known for being a poet, and maybe sometimes that got in his way. Maybe he thought too much, but I think he was known as a really good guy. The problem he had was, Borg was immensely popular everywhere he went, and right. Connors, certainly in the States, was very popular by '77. But I will say, to get to the heart of your question, that when he came from behind to defeat Connors in the '77 U.S. Open final after dropping the first set 6-2 and eventually winning 6-love in the fourth, there were a lot of Latin Americans in the crowd. He got a lot of crowd support for what was probably the biggest tournament of his career in many, many ways, to win the Open. And then as he beat Jimmy again, that gets back to your point about the matchup, he actually beat him in Madison Square Garden the end of that season, and in the round robin, which was a remarkable win to beat Jimmy indoors. Connors was maybe even more heavily favored, I think, to beat him there than he was at the Open, because they were still on the clay, still on the Hartrue at Forest Hills. But to beat him in Madison Square Garden in those conditions in a great 3-set match, that was a staggering feat on his part, and proof that he could play. He wasn't strictly a clay court player. He'd shown us that before, but it was nice that he showcased it at the very end of that '77 season.
Incredibly. He also won 16 titles that year and played an incredible 150 matches. He went 136-14, which was his record. And you mentioned the grass. Because back then the Australian Open in '77 was played at the beginning of the year, and he'd made the final that year, losing to Roscoe Tanner 3-3 in the final. And he also, you mentioned those streaks that he had kind of at the end of the season, which was after Wimbledon when he lost to Billy Martin in the third round.
Yeah, exactly. That was it. blemish post Roland Garros. When Wimbledon it was just a blip on the screen. It really didn't mean much because he just barreled through the summer after that. He wasn't ready to play on. He could play on grass. We saw that at the Masters a few years earlier in '74. But he, it was a pretty tough turnaround. Borg managed to 3 years in a row from '78 through '80 managed to pull off that Roland Garros Wimbledon double back to back, which is awfully hard to do, and later accomplished by Federer and Nadal, but not easy in the least. But Vilas was becoming more versatile, and I think that despite the fact that Borg beat him handily in the semifinals of that Masters, the fact that he could beat Jimmy indoors it just was sort of the icing on the cake for a great season. And I was at the time working at World Tennis Magazine, and our rankings were pretty prestigious at the time. The ATP official rankings were not as highly regarded back then because they were still relatively new. They'd only started in '73, and we gave Vilas the #1 ranking. Our panel of experts gave it to him, and the next day we went over to his hotel and he posed with a T-shirt that said #1, and it really meant a lot to him. And then in the ensuing years, and more recently when they kind of delved back into the ATP records, it was discovered that it appeared to be a mistake somewhere along the line. They didn't put the rankings out every week as planned, and Vilas should have at some point. He really should have ended '77 at #1, frankly. But at the very least, he should have had that #1 ranking somewhere along the line, and he's never had the satisfaction of that. But what we did at World Tennis, I'm kind of proud of the fact that we did that because he was the worthiest. Borg had a great year, but Vilas had a better one.
Yeah, that was actually one of the questions that I had. So, and you basically already answered, but like just to develop a little bit on the ranking systems, because he ended up finished the year at world #2, and the ATP ranking is still today. It doesn't show the rankings that you guys gave him. It only shows the ATP one, so you'd have to search a little further than the official website. But it's. I've read a couple articles and people expressing their opinions on how he actually deserved that ranking. And could you just develop a little bit more on just the ranking systems? How did that work in that time? Why exactly he didn't get the #1? And
Well, he didn't get it. What happened was, as I was saying, there appeared to be some weeks where they should have put out the ranking and didn't. Now it's automatic, and these days, it's right now we're on hold because of the pandemic. But leave that aside. The ATP rankings are officially released every single week, or in the case of the majors, they wait for the 2 weeks to be completed. So, but for some reason, there were a couple where they didn't get around to doing it. And some of the historians who looked into this are convinced that he would have achieved it somewhere along the line had they not missed it. That was an unfortunate thing because the ATP is very professional. They've, in the more modern times, they've done a fantastic job with their rankings and with the releasing of the rankings and all the different scenarios for what it will take a particular player to do in a given year to be #1. But Vilas it was very unfortunate for him that he never had the satisfaction of seeing out. Now, similarly, among the women, at one time, the WTA had lost track of the fact that Yvonne Goolagong in 1976 had reached #1. And that one of their stars there who worked for the WTA, a guy named John Dolan, dug into it and I think he found it on paper, but he found the evidence that Yvonne had been at #1, which we all knew at the time. But they didn't have an official record of it for a long time, and he uncovered it. So at least in Goolagong's case, she had the satisfaction of an official #1 next to her name for historical purposes. Vilas does not have that, which is sad because it wasn't just our magazine, but other experts at the time clearly believed that he deserved it.
Yeah, and maybe just kind of one of the things that interests me the most about Vilas, especially as a South American, I would say, is his clay prowess. He was so good on clay. I think he has the most matches won on clay ever at 600 and something. And if you go back to compare, like you mentioned a little bit of the double Roland Garros Wimbledon, and coming back to a little bit more present times in the 2008 Nadal season, how hard is it to do that? And I think because Vilas wasn't able to do, said it was a blip. But how hard exactly would you say it is to actually do that? And do you think that is something that is a little bit of a stain on that season of his?
Not really. No, not really. I would say this. I think it was harder then. It's what makes it all the more remarkable that Borg could, for 3 straight years from 78 through 80, win them both, because there was more of a discrepancy. There was more of a speed difference back then. The courts were faster. The grass was different than it is now. So it was a harder turnaround. It was harder to make the surface transition than it is now. The grass is slower, and I think the players, it's easier for them to adapt. It was a great achievement for Nadal and Federer to do it, but what it took for Borg to do it was monumental. And Vilas just didn't quite have the. I think he was probably it was just probably more of an emotional letdown, because he did sweep through the French. So I don't think physically he killed himself that tournament the way he normally might at Roland Garros. But the changing conditions and the quicker grass then made it pretty hard for him and left him vulnerable, for sure, on the quicker courts.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of adapting, I think, 2 things actually. So we mentioned the French Open, and I know that he lost to Gottfried twice prior to that French Open final. Gottfried got him in the final of Palm Springs and Baltimore, and they weren't on clay. But how did he manage to produce one of the most one-sided finals? Losing just 3 games. Yeah.
Brian Gottfried is a guy I know well, and he's a great guy. He'd be the first to admit that he was pretty pleased to just find himself in the finals of the French Open. He was a better player on grass, where he got to the semis of Wimbledon, and hard courts, where he did really well at the U.S. Open. Brian was not expected to be in that final, and he just was outclassed. It was a matchup problem. He just was not capable of staying Guillermo from the backcourt in any way. And he had to look for ways to attack, and then he was just playing right into Vilas's hands then as well. So I think that was really a matchup thing more than anything else. Both players knew when they walked on the court what was going to happen.
Right, and then the most...
I don't mean that Gottfried had given up, or he was throwing in the towel, or that he wasn't going to try. He just knew what he was up against.
Yeah, that happens.
Yeah, I mean, and in the U.S. Open final as well, I mean, Connors had Vilas there, because he took the first set 6-2, and it was one of Vilas's greatest triumphs, certainly, I believe, to come back, and he totally had Connors on his heels. I believe he changed tactics after that first set, and what do you think, in your opinion, what made the difference in that final, and how was Vilas able to kind of turn that around?
Well, it's so often the case when you split the first 2 sets in a best of 5 set final, that third set is critical. And Connors had set points. He could well have gotten himself up 2-1 and been in the driver's seat. When that set got away and Vilas won it, Jimmy, I think he was a little deflated. He didn't quit. He played hard, but Vilas really, really played a magnificent form, and he didn't miss much. And by then, he had the crowd. He just sensed that this was going to be his day. I think it would have been very different, because he'd already lost the first set decisively, comes back and win the second. If he then drops the third, I think it would have been very hard for him to turn it around and win 2 in a row against Connors at that stage. So it all swung. The pendulum swung late in the third set back to Vilas after he recovered from set points down.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed that he was hitting a lot of slice approach shots and really testing Connors' ability to generate pace off of both sides.
It was the right way to play, Jimmy. You're absolutely right. And sometimes he'd slice and come in on his forehand, and Jimmy was more comfortable passing off his backhand, and that worked. And yes, you tried to give him low balls, not much pace, make Jimmy generate and make him dig out the low ball, because Connors did not really hit with he was essentially a flat ball hitter. So he really never hit with any pronounced topspin off his forehand side or the backhand, and therefore that slice of Vilas's was particularly effective against Connors. But it was a bitter defeat for Connors, because there was a controversy about the match point. There was no way Vilas was going to lose, but Connors thought his last shot was in. There was some doubt about whether he'd won the point or not, but there was no call, and there was bedlam. And suddenly there were all these people on the court, and Connors almost got in a scuffle with a photographer, and he later said the next day, as far as I'm concerned, the match is not over, which seems silly to some people because considering that Vilas was up 5-love in the fourth. That was the only unfortunate thing about it. Vilas had played so beautifully to put himself in this commanding position. You wish it could have ended on a more normal note, so that you didn't have that minor controversy to stain the occasion, which it did, only in a minor way.
Let's see.
And I guess since we're speaking of controversies, I guess we can start moving on. Do you guys have anything else that you guys like to add about Vilas 1997, or we could maybe start moving on to McEnroe 1984?
Sure, let's go. Well, I'm happy to move on to McEnroe.
Yeah.
Sure.
That's it.
Yeah. So I guess we can start with the obvious. It's something that popped out in a lot of people's TV screens when Djokovic was winning in 2011. That winning streak. What can we say a little bit about that? How can we talk about that a little bit more in this starting the 1984?
42 matches in a row, right?
Yeah.
Actually, 39, because Djokovic eventually broke his record in 2011. But the main point was he didn't lose. The fascinating similarity between McEnroe's and Djokovic's seasons, 84 and then 2011, is neither one lost prior to the French. Then John goes French and we can talk in more depth about it, but he loses after going up 2-0 against Lendl. And that's his first loss of the whole year, one of only 3 losses in the entire campaign. Won 82 out of 85 matches, so it was a phenomenal season. And yet he lost in Paris. And Djokovic, kind of similar. He hasn't lost. He wins 41 matches in a row, leading up to his loss to Federer in the semis of the French. And that was kind of a little bit of bad luck for Djokovic because he'd had about 4 days off. He'd got a default in the 4th round. He had all these days off leading up to the Federer match, and he was uneven and rusty, and it went over 2 days, and Federer played brilliantly to beat him, no doubt about it, but it was tough luck for Djokovic. But with John, he was just what was remarkable about it is he had a bunch of clay court wins. It started off indoors in Philly that year, and he just kept going, and a lot of these were clay court wins, and he's knocking off Lendl, who in many eyes was the best clay court player in the world at the time. And it just didn't seem, no matter what the surface was, McEnroe was destroying everybody. He was playing fast court tennis on slower courts. That's what made, to me, his performance at not only Roland Garros, but the other clay court tournaments so special, is that he didn't seem to compromise much. He'd attack guys and even come in occasionally on their first serves, almost always on their second. He just was attacking relentlessly, but not missing much off the ground either. It was by far his best season ever in pro tennis, far and away. But the nightmare for him was that he had to have one of the 3 losses. I mean, he had lost to Vijay Armitage in the summer in Cincinnati, and he lost to Sundstrom in the finals of the Davis Cup. Okay, the Vijay match, I don't think he really cared that it happened. It was probably good for him to lose a match at that stage, but to lose to Lendl in Paris from the position he was in, he talks about it to this day. I would only want to add one comment about that. McEnroe, it's always just looked at only from McEnroe's standpoint, that he's up 2-0 and he wins the first 2 3-2, and he looks like he's galloping toward a straight set win. And Lendl came back and beat him 4-5-5 those last 3 sets. And I think Lendl deserves more credit. Lendl had never won a major. Lendl had been in 4 finals before that. It's similar to Andy Murray before he finally won the U.S. Open in 2012. Very similar, in that Lendl had that label being pinned on him, why can't you win a major? So he finally wins a major in dramatic fashion from 2 sets down, and also down 4-2 in the 4th set. He was in real danger. And all everybody wants to talk about is what happened to McEnroe. Everybody was only looking at it from the standpoint of McEnroe. I think Lendl's comeback was spectacular, and I don't think that McEnroe should have to take as much blame, and I think there should have been more plaudits for Lendl for what he managed to do to turn that match around.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess in that regard, it's kind of McEnroe. Obviously, people probably talk about it most because it was just as unbelievable. I guess when I was watching 2011 and I saw him going out to Federer in 4, it just seemed like it just seemed like the day was not going to come that he was going to lose, and that's probably what feels so astounding about this defeat, because being 2 sets to love up, and you get to lose to a guy who has never won a major. It just seemed at that moment that was impossible to happen.
Well, it's true, but of course we all knew how great Lendl was. We knew what he'd done in '82 and '83 of the years when he got to the U.S. Open finals, and he lost the '83 Australian to Wilander, which is a little surprising too in some ways. So we knew how great he was, but
and Lendl had already.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Lendl had already gotten to number 1, and had won 39 titles prior to getting to that final. He was a seasoned professional.
Absolutely, and we all thought, many of us thought, after he beat McEnroe in the '82 semis of the Open, that he was going to win that, and then Connors beat him in 4, and then the next year we thought, okay, he'll do it now. Connors beat him in 4 again, so he'd been knocking on the door, and yes, he'd won all those other titles, but his time was going to come. It just, nobody was really planning for it to happen in the fashion that it did, from 2 sets down against somebody who'd been beating him regularly all season long. So it was it was tough for McEnroe, no doubt about it. But it was also a really, really a remarkable performance from Lendl in the way he turned it into a war of attrition. He did I think he wore him down physically a little bit, and then some of McEnroe's outbursts, some of the volatility may have also sapped him of a little energy, because he didn't have as much spring in his step that last couple of sets, despite the fact that they were so close.
So many chances.
And that again is something to be said in Lendl's favor, and not so much that McEnroe did not collapse and go down 6-2 in the 5th. He was up 4-2 in the 4th, and he lost that 7-5, and then the 5th was really tight all the way until he finally lost at 7-5 in the 5th. So you really can't. And McEnroe had break points at 3-all in the 5th. So it really was. He fought hard, but eventually got outplayed by a guy who really was a better clay court player than he was.
What did you think about the match point, the forehand inside out volley put away?
Yeah, he had the court open, no doubt about it. But that's pressure when you're serving match point down, and
serving second.
What's that?
Serving second in the 5th as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. Serving from behind is never easy in the 5th. So he felt the pressure, knowing if he doesn't make the volley, the match is over. Right. So but it was unfortunate for him. All I'll say is this: it's not like some of the other guys though who won all the other majors. At that time, McEnroe had hardly gone to the Australian. He never played. He lost in '83 to Wilander. He just didn't tend to make that trip. He barely played the Australian in his career. He stayed away from it because it was at the end of the year during his prime, and he came back again when he got disqualified in the '90s. But it was too late. And I just think so. He was always going to have no Australian on his record, but he sure would have loved to have had that one French, just to add that to the 3 Wimbledons and 4 U.S. to round out his record. It would have been a nice thing for him to have, because Connors was never able to win the French, and Pete Sampras was never able to win it, and McEnroe was, agonizingly close.
Yeah, and, you mentioned we talked a lot about Lendl, but obviously some of his statistics in 1984. He had 24 top 10 wins that year, which, by the way, is the second most in the Open era, tied with Nadal and Djokovic, who each had 24 top 10 wins in 2013. And he went 6-0 against Connors and 6-1 against Lendl, and that one loss was obviously the most crushing.
And there's another example of the parallels between, Djokovic and McEnroe in their great seasons of '84 and 2011, is that you look at the record that Djokovic had and he was 6-0 against Nadal that year, and that included wins over Rafa in the Wimbledon U.S. Open finals, a couple of times on the clay, big wins, and then 4-1 against Federer. So it's really reminiscent of what McEnroe was doing against his top competition, like Lendl and Connors, back in 1984. The domination is remarkable in both cases.
Absolutely. And then you also mentioned, you mentioned 6-1 against Lendl. I thought it was an incredible mental feat, and incredible that he was able to defeat Lendl handedly in the U.S. Open final that year in straight sets, especially coming off of this crushing defeat at the French.
That was interesting, because what happened there was that McEnroe had, what made it more remarkable was Lendl played the opening men's semifinal. That was the great Super Saturday that many of us thought it could not be surpassed. But Lendl saved a match point and had a grueling match against Pat Cash in the semis and got through it in 5. And then the women's final was Navratilova and Everett, and a great 3-setter. And we come to Mackinac Connors, who ended somewhere, I think, at 11-16 in the evening, 5 more sets. But here's Mackinac with a lot less rest time than Lendl had. But as it turned out, Lendl was a little bit more fragile physically than he was. And John played a great match to take him apart in straight sets. I don't think either one of them were feeling that great. Those were the days when you had no day off, and thankfully that's all been changed. But he also was just confident. The beating Connors in 5 sets, it was very uplifting to him, I guess. And I just think he felt at that point he had enough left in the tank and he really served and volleyed brilliantly against Lendl. Now, a year later, Ivan turned the tables and beat John in straight sets in the 85 U.S. Open final. But we need to stay on topic here, so.
Yeah, no problem. So, I guess we did the winning streak a bit, but it's a whole season, and if he just lost there and he had a terrible, obviously we know he didn't have a terrible end of the season post French Open, but what are some other of his impressive things in the season that are not necessarily as talked about as the great streak, you would say?
The final.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was gonna say the final of Wimbledon when he crushed Connors, 1-2 and 2.
It was the best. That Wimbledon final is probably the best match he's ever played. Connors 2 years earlier had beaten McEnroe in 5 sets, and this one figured to be another close match too. And if you think about how only a few months later they go 5 at the U.S. Open, but what McEnroe did to Connors on the center court that day was it was breathtaking. Jimmy had himself destroyed Ken Rosewall on the same court, of course, 10 years earlier, to win his first Wimbledon. And he had been pretty devastating to beat Rosewall 1-1 and 4. But what McEnroe did to him was it was devastating. And it says a lot for Connors that he did make it so close again at the U.S. Open later in the year. But McEnroe, just everything he touched turned to gold that day in the Wimbledon final. I never saw him play a better match. Maybe occasionally in the WCT finals or the Masters, but considering what the occasion was and who the opponent was, and that same guy had beaten him in the finals 2 years earlier, it was pretty dazzling stuff from McEnroe. And I think he would say, certainly if you asked him about that particular year, he didn't play a better match in 1984.
Yeah. I mean, many people talk about McEnroe in 1984, and today it's one of the most talked about seasons. And, he was only 25, and, he never won another slam after that. And he got to just one other Grand Slam final. And, he did have a brief resurgence in 92 when he played the semis against Agassi that year.
True.
But, why do you think after 25 he...
we would not, none of us would have believed it. Back at that time, of course, it's such a contrast from this era now where you're seeing Federer 39 and he's probably going to play until he's 41 if we're lucky, and we'll see how long the Rafa and Novak go, but they'll probably go into I think Novak will go into his late 30s and Rafa might get past 35. But at that time, you tended to think of 25 as the absolute peak. However, nobody thought, you certainly thought he could play top flight up till 30 and win a bunch more majors. But what happened is the next year is when he lost that U.S. Open final to Lendl. That was a crushing blow in its way. And then the end of that year, he lost to Brad Gilbert at the Masters and decided to take 6 months off. And he was really never the same after the 6 months off. Came back in a pretty good 89 when he got back into the top 5 and he won Dallas over Lendl, but he was never really the same McEnroe. And I think if he had it to do over again, he wouldn't have taken the 6-month hiatus. He would have tried to just stick with it and keep playing. And I think that sort of changed him forever.
Speaking more about McEnroe just in general today, because he's around the tennis scenes a lot and he's a commentator, obviously, for NBC and ESPN, and, very polarizing figure. And obviously casual fans think of McEnroe and they think of his angry outbursts and his abuse of rackets and umpires. But I mean, how do you think fans and people should view him today and, this season in particular? Because, is his genius on the court and some of his all-court game? Do you think that's maybe underrated or, slightly overshadowed by the other parts of his personality?
I think the fact that he's still so visible as a commentator does make people, I suspect there are a lot of people in your age bracket and people in their 20s and 30s that didn't get a chance to really see him play in his prime that go back and watch on YouTube now. I have to believe that because there's a fascination with him and he's so visible. And that's not true of all the other ex-greats. So yeah. I think that probably helps. But there's no doubt he was a genius. There's no doubt we haven't seen anybody play quite like him. The deft touch and the way he set up the stance on his serve and what he could do on the overhead. He was spectacular at the net. And I think that I hope that a lot of young people are going back to see that because he really was an artist. He was an artist on a tennis court, no doubt about that. And it's too bad that the second half of his 20s, it didn't work out nearly as well as the first half. Should have lasted longer at the top of his game. I wish he had.
Yeah. It's a. I started watching sort of because of my dad used to watch Borg, and Borg was his biggest idol, and he was pretty sad when he lost the final in 1981 to McEnroe. It was basically one of the most intense matches, I guess, of all time. Not the 81, but the 80. But there was also a big turning point, I guess.
81 was a big turning point, no doubt about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Borg had won 5 in a row, so he lost again at Wimbledon. And McEnroe had some controversial moments, some temporary eruptions early in the tournament, and they really wanted to. Some of the officials wanted to have him thrown out of the tournament, and some of the people from the ATP, including Butch Buchholz, had to persuade the Wimbledon management not to do that and to allow him to play on. But John, when he played Borg in the final, there was no volatility whatsoever. He was calm as can be because he felt he had to be when he played Borg, and it was a performance, and he won it in 4. But just to put 84 in perspective, to go 82-3, to win 13 tournaments, to have these 3 isolated losses. Two of the 3 were significant losses. One being in that loss in the finals of the French, and the other being in the Davis Cup final. But still, it was a riveting and astonishing campaign from beginning to end for him. And he closed it out by winning the Masters, which was another big triumph for him at the very end of the year. It'll always be remembered as one of the great seasons in the modern era of pro tennis.
Where would you overall open era? Would you rank it in the top 3 or 4?
Oh yeah, I would. I don't. It's hard to rank anything much above it. Now another great season, but was Jimmy Connors in '74, won 99 of 103 matches and won 14 tournaments, and he won 3 of the 4 majors and couldn't play in Roland Garros. That was pretty remarkable too. But I think the Mackinac competition was tougher in '84, and Connors won a lot of tournaments that which would be comparable today to ATP 250s. And so his record was padded by that, despite the fact that he won the 2 biggest at Wimbledon and the Open and Australia as well. I'd say Mackinac 84 was greater, and then we could argue about where it ranks up against the Djokovic in 2011 or 2015 or. Yeah. There's some others that are comparable, but I would say none better than what McEnroe did in '84.
I would agree.
Yeah, and I guess it's a really a good spot as well to move on to Andre Agassi 99. As you mentioned as well that McEnroe had a big downfall and never was the same after '84. And we have Agassi, who had somewhat of the same story, but he has kind of like his Cinderella story. He came back in '99. He essentially turned the tables on his career. So how can we compare Agassi's 99 to Agassi's rest of the 90s and that resurgence in his career, really?
Well, resurgence is the word. I mean, he'd had some other great seasons. 92 when he won his first major at Wimbledon, and he had a great 94 winning his first U.S. Open, and up and down years. But 99 was his finest season because that's when he became the 5th player ever to win the all 4 Grand Slam tournaments in the same year, in a career, not the same year, in a career. So to do a career Grand Slam and come from 2 sets down in the French Open final against Medvedev was a wonderful accomplishment. And he'd been thinking about not even playing the French because he had some shoulder issues. But his coach, Brad Gilbert, talked him into it. And then he goes to Wimbledon and plays quite beautifully at Wimbledon before losing in the finals to a top-of-the-line Pete Sampras in what I think might have been the signature match of Pete Sampras' career. I really believe it was, when he beat Agassi 3, 4, and 5 in the final. But then Agassi, after taking a couple more losses to Sampras over the summer of '99, comes back and wins the U.S. Open. Sampras had a pull out of the Open, and Agassi beat Todd Martin in a 5-set final. And then he lost in the final to Sampras in the year-end championships. But it was considering what had happened to him post '95. That's what made '99 so great. He lost to Sampras in the '95 U.S. Open final, which was a pivotal match in both of their careers because that was essentially settling who would be number 1 for that year. And Agassi had beaten Sampras in Australia. Sampras had won Wimbledon. So this one was sort of, there was so much riding on the outcome there. And then after that '95 season, he went into a tailspin. And he did okay in '96 and won an Olympic gold, but by and large, disappointing year. '97 played very little, didn't do well. '98 started working his way back. So to do what he did in '99 and win 2 majors and finish the year number 1, I think he would always say it was his greatest campaign ever.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, people talk about Agassi. The 2 years they bring up is '95 and '99, and to me, '99 is even more impressive, just given his ability to bounce back from playing all those challenges. At one point, dropping to 141 in the world in November of '97.
Exactly. 97 goes down to 141, but then he had himself back in the top 6 the next year. It was a great recovery, and then 99 he's back at the very top. Yeah. Now, I think it was a very rewarding season for him in so many ways because he had lost the Roland Garros finals. He had
90 and 91
lost Courier and Gomez. And in 90 and 91, and I think he might have thought that time had passed him by there because the clay was not his favorite. He was very good on it, but he preferred hard court. So I think he may have surprised himself with what he did there, but he was on such a high when he came to Wimbledon that he goes all the way to the finals there and then played some great tennis in New York to win the U.S. Open because Todd Martin played one of his most impressive career matches to go up 2-1 against Agassi in the U.S. Open final, and Agassi wore him down and won in 5 sets.
Yeah, and
obviously we can't put this here. This was not a McEnroe 84 or a Connors 74, but it was still the season of his career. It was a culmination of it was a great comeback season in many ways because he had won no majors in '96, 7, or 8, and here he is pulling off 2. And especially winning Roland Garros, and so I think it for him personally it was a shining season to be sure.
Yeah, I guess it's really the point here because the season is not probably like a top 5 that you would make, but considering his past years and what he did, and even considering, for example, McEnroe 84, he did great against his rivals, but Agassi did pretty poorly against Sampras that year.
Yes, he
winning
did.
only once, but that was still a massive season for him, for his career, and winning Roland Garros definitely was impressive.
What was interesting at the end, though, was I think he wanted to wanted to underline what he may have regarded as his supremacy for the year. And in the round robin of the year-end championships, the ATP year-end championships, he beat Sampras handily. But then when they met again in the finals, and it was much more at stake, it was Sampras who rose to the occasion and beat him. So that was something of a dampener for Agassi, who had already lost it to Sampras in the Wimbledon final and in hard courts over the summer in L.A. and Cincinnati. So to lose to him again in the year, but it still didn't tarnish what was a really extraordinary season for him in every way. Just a great year.
Yeah. And what was also so extraordinary is he made 4 slam finals in a row there by winning the French, getting to the finals of Wimbledon, winning the U.S., and then he eventually got Sampras in the semis of the Australian the next year and won Australia.
2000. That's true. That's true.
And so he was one match away from potentially the Agassi slam.
You're right. You're right. I mean, it was a great stretch. Obviously, we're talking about a different year there in 2000, but he played a great match against Sampras. It was hanging in the balance. He was down 2-1 and 2 points from losing that match, and then he came back and won the 4-set tiebreak and ran away with a fifth. Yeah, it was a great stretch for him, although he didn't really keep it going the rest of 2000. But let's leave that one aside. I still think it's a season well worth talking about, and one that Agassi would always say was gratifying, the most gratifying season of his career for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think one of the things that I'm thinking about as well is how 99 is pretty close to our time in a way. Like all of the Grand Slams are already in the current surfaces that they are right now, but there was still some difference. So serve and volley was still pretty much king, as Sampras is case in point. So how different was it like for Agassi as a baseliner, really playing that in that time in '99 as well?
He didn't feel like he had to change his game that much. First of all, he was never that comfortable at the net. The technique was never that great, and he felt like if he was returning well, and he was such an aggressive returner, different kind of returner in some ways from Djokovic. He didn't get as many returns back. He didn't have as much reach, but boy, if he read your serve, he could blast return to serve winners. And his serve by then had improved immensely as well. He had a much better, especially first serve, had much more beef on it. So I think he felt like he didn't have that many adjustments, but he also knew that if Sampras was on, he was in for some trouble, especially on the grass. So I remember him saying, after losing the Wimbledon final that year, said something to the effect of to Buck Collins in the well, I guess it's he knew what Sampras could do to him on a grass court, all things being equal. And he caught Pete not on an all things being equal day. He caught him at his very best.
For sure. I always thought of Sampras, and I always thought of the Sampras and Agassi rivalry in majors that, Sampras often had Agassi's number at the Wimbledon and the U.S. Open. He was 6-0 in their rivalry there, but then Andre would always flip it at the French and at the Australian Open. So, I mean, given that Agassi had the 4 majors and he won the career slam, I mean, how do you kind of see those two careers?
Well, I would only say this. There was only one of those that you mentioned. He beat him once at the French in a quarter, and he beat him a couple of times in Australia, yes, but only once in the final. So the 5 major finals they play, he loses 4. They played the U.S. Open 4 times when you add in their epic quarter 2001. He never once beat him in what you could regard as a neutral setting on hard courts in New York, a place where Agassi loved to perform. And then, as you alluded to, 2 losses to Pete at Wimbledon, most importantly, the final in '99, but also a quarter in '93. So to me, yes, Agassi, I mean, historically, he, among the Open era players, he belongs right up there, given that he has a career Grand Slam. But versus Sampras, I think there's a big gap, despite the fact that Pete did not win. There's a big, and Sampras proved in their biggest matches that he was the better. Not to diminish Agassi, but I think those are the facts.
I would completely agree. Yeah. Additionally, also, I just really want to go back to the French Open final with Medvedev, just because I also read a really interesting article about Medvedev almost wanting to retire or thinking about retiring, and he met Agassi at a bar in Monte Carlo in April, and he was saying, I'm about to retire, and what am I going to do? And Agassi kind of gave him a pep talk and cheered him up and said, it's all good. I've come back. I've struggled the last 2 years, and here I am. And Medvedev had him at 2-0 up, and I believe there was a rain delay in the 3rd set, and Brad Gilbert really
the rain delay him, and Gilbert was able to talk to Agassi a little bit as coach, get him 5. But what's ironic about that story is that Gilbert had talked Agassi into playing the French Open, not into quitting altogether, but there was always this chance that if Gilbert had not persuaded Agassi, that neither one of those guys would have been in that final. Medvedev also beat Sampras early in that same French Open. So, and the first 2 sets, it was devastating, 1 and 2. He just crushed him the first 2, and maybe it was too easy, and then maybe he just started I think he just got too conscious of what he was on the verge of accomplishing. And guys at his level are sometimes a little afraid of winning, if you can believe it. So there's actually a fear of winning. They can't quite believe that they're in that position. And Agassi, I think, somewhere deep inside him knew that, and it was a really spirited comeback he made, and he deserved it, to be sure, to come back and win in 5.
Absolutely. And just to add, in the third set, he was serving at 4-all, 30, and he missed his first serve. So a lot of pressure on that and second serve, and I think he came up with a beautiful forehand drop volley.
He did. That was set up by a very deep second serve. I mean, not a couple inches from the line. I mean, it was gutsy second serve that set that up for him. But he could have found himself with Medvedev serving for the match. That was a very important game. And after that, there was never too much doubt that he was going to win once he won the third set. I never really felt like I thought Medvedev looked quite deflated after that third set.
An interesting parallel, another Medvedev 20 years later, losing a final in the fifth set, 6-4.
Yeah, exactly. Daniel Medvedev, absolutely. Same name, different country. But anyway.
One of the things that I've been looking at in terms of, well, you mentioned how Agassi have completed the French Open, I mean, the career slam with the French Open, and this kind of has become a sort of like a staple of the great players of who can complete the career Grand Slam. And how would you say like this, for example, compares with Rod Laver in '69 when he became the first and only man to ever win the slam in the same year?
Well, Laver had won his first, Laver had won his first in '62 as an amateur. The one in '69 was a much bigger deal. We had Don Budge in third as well, and Little Mo Connolly in '53, and Margaret Court eventually won it in '70, and Steffi Graf in '88. Pretty elite group. But to get to the point of Laver in '69, it's the first full year of the major in open tennis because we started with the French Open in '68. So the Australian didn't have an open event in '68. So here's the first full available shot for anybody, the Grand Slam. So Laver, in the first full year of open tennis, '69, set out to do this. And the Australian was at the start of the year. But he had an epic match against Tony Roach in the semifinals that he won in 5, and that led to led the way to him beat Andre Semeno in the finals. And then he goes to Paris, and he lost to Rosewall the year before, and this time he turned the tables and beat Rosewall in the finals. And then he goes to Wimbledon, where he beats Arthur Ashe and John Newcomb, and he finally finishes it off at the U.S. Open at Forest Hills on the grass. These are the days 3 of the 4 on the grass, and he beat Arthur Ashe there again. Arthur was the defending champion, beat him in the semis, and beat Roach in the final, which was very satisfying because Roach had given him a lot of problems throughout the year. To me, if you saw these players that Laver competed against at that time, like Roach, like John Newcomb, he had very tough competition at the top. It wasn't that he was that much better than those guys. So I think it has to go down as one of we have to mention that among the great years because altogether too he won 17 tournaments that year at Laver. So in over 100 matches, it was against fierce competition, and he was under enormous pressure because he had this goal to do it, and he pulled it off. He pulled it off as only he could, and I was lucky enough to see him win the last 2 of those at Wimbledon in the U.S. and he was a joy to watch in those days, Rod Laver.
That's amazing. I keep looking at trying to see if I can find some clips of him playing on YouTube. It's really hard to find like full matches, and it's tough. But yeah,
well,
from what I could see,
he was a shot maker. Laver was a real shot maker, left-hander, big forearm, not a big serve, but well placed. He could kick it, he could slice it, get in volley very effectively behind it. But I think the standout feature of his game to me was the passing shots he'd make on the run. These spectacular winners he could hit from anywhere on the court, and that could demoralize his opponents. And he had he had a classic lefty topspin forehand, but it was his backhand I think was the standout because he could slice it or come over it. And Laver was he was very versatile and very, very crafty player.
Yeah, and if we come back to 99 and the career Grand Slam, you mentioned that a lot of the Grand Slams were on grass at that time, three out of the four. So how would you say you rank even with that difference in surfaces in the career slam? Would you say is it harder to complete a career slam in the three different surfaces, or is it still the hardest achievement was still Lavers to get to win all of them in the same year?
Yeah, that's the thing. You're doing it in the same year. So if you don't win the first, you wait till the next year. That's what made the accomplishments so mighty. Is that you had to keep coming through when it counted, and you don't just start it. You don't just start off when you feel like it and go into the next year. I mean, obviously Djokovic has done that, and that is also a great accomplishment. What he did in 2015 and 16 to win 4 in a row, but it's not as difficult as winning 4 in the same year, even if it is only on 2 surfaces. When you consider that he had a deal with the likes of Ken Rosewell on clay and John Newcomb on grass and Tony Roach on grass and Arthur Ashe and Dennis Ralston and the young Stan Smith. There were a lot of formidable opponents that he had, and he dealt with all of them. And I think it was we have to mention that as another of the great seasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely.
So we're going to go to Federer now.
Is Vansh, do you have anything else? Yeah, if Vansh doesn't have anything to add, any questions that you might have on the Agassi still?
I think we've basically covered Agassi, and we talked about how it propelled his career to go on and have a long, still pretty great career in the 2000s.
Yes,
tally and eventually competing with Federer.
Yeah, which was for me quite interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick comment there. It's those wasted. 96 was largely wasted. 97 was almost totally wasted. And 98, he kind of got back to being serious. So I think the fact that he had a couple of years in his 20s where he didn't really apply himself was one of the reasons why he played so beautifully up into his mid 30s. Is that he there was more incentive and energy left. I mean, Sampras by 31 had it. Edberg at 30 had it. But Agassi had that something propelling him, and knew that he had wasted some time. They hadn't really given it his all during part of his 20s. So he made up for it in his 30s.
How crucial was his relationship with Steffi Graf at that time, after they both won the French in '99, to kind of have her as a rock to lean on, and eventually, I'd imagine that you have given him some positive energy too.
No, I don't think there's any.
Well.
And I think she inspired him, and I think she encouraged him, and I think he used to, he ended up with 8 majors. But I'll tell you a quick funny story is that after he won his 6th, somebody on the tour congratulated one of the guys I know who works on the tour, and he saw him the next time he saw him. He says, "Congratulations on number 6," and he said, "No, it's not number 6. It's number 28," meaning that he and Steffi together had 28. That was how he looked at it. Now it was all in the family, but I think she really did inspire him, and she had a totally different temperament, and her game was different, and obviously she didn't have a 2-hander, and she had that incredible inside-out forehand and a good serve. But the bottom line is, I think he really admired what she did in her career, and she felt like she could help him to still play great tennis, and there's no doubt that was it. Only the two of them could tell us, but judging from my vantage point, I'd say she made a big difference.
Yeah, and I guess this is also great because to segue into Federer's seasons, because honestly, when I looked in the early Big Three when Federer was about 226, and he was moving on to 2012 with all the doubts, and he was in his early 30s, I would look into Agassi and imagine him. The epitome of going deep into your 30s was for me Andre Agassi's 35, but obviously back into Federer's basic agreed prime in 2006. That was one of the 2 years that he won three of the 4 Grand Slams. So How would you say Federer's 2006 season was? Like, what was his biggest accomplishment? How does it rank amongst the greatest?
Well, only slightly better than his 2005.
Yeah.
2005, the year before, he didn't win. He didn't make all the finals. He lost to Nadal in the semis of the. He was beaten by Nadal and Safin. That he had only a slightly less great season in that. No, he didn't make all 4 finals, but he still only lost 4 matches in 2005, and he still won Wimbledon and the Open. And so I think that was a great year, and he had some problems with an injury late in the season that maybe caused him to lose in the year-end finals to Nalbandian. But 2006 was stunning because there he goes 92-5, and so he played even more and only lost 1 more match, and he did get to all the finals, and he did win. In 2006, he was even more. It was even better because he won 3 of the 4. He didn't have to settle for 2, and almost put himself in a position to win the French, because he lost to Nadal after winning the first set 6-1, and early in the second set, Federer had 40 love on his serve, and Nadal came back and broke him, and that proved to be critical. And eventually, Nadal beat him in the tiebreak in the 4th set, but Federer was off to a blazing start, and I think had he won that match, he might well have won the Grand Slam. I don't think he would have gotten nervous at Wimbledon and the Open. I think we might have seen him join the Grand Slammers, as we call them. But Nadal, of course, never lost to him on that court, and it took a lot to shake Rafa and make him worry too much. And Federer was not able to sustain that early form. But boy, he was great at the other majors, and he had won the Open over Agassi the year before, and in 2006 he beat Roddick in a nice final there, and he just was great all around in 2006. There was no doubting himself at all. I think if you asked him when his career's over, he'd say that was. Would he say he was the best tennis he ever played? I don't know if he'd say that, but he would have to say it was the most consistent success he's ever had.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, since 2004 to 2007, I'd say is peak Federer years. And you mentioned, 2005, 4 losses, but in 2 of those matches he had match points against Agassi and Monte Carlo, and then Safin, obviously you referred to that, where he had the match point in the tiebreak.
Killer. The Safin one was a killer, and he tried a tweener. He chased down a lob from Safin, and he should have thrown up a lob himself. And it wasn't actually like Roger. Yes, he loved hitting the tweener, but not on such a big point, not with so much riding. And I think if he could have thrown up a decent lob, after Safin had lobbed over him, maybe he gets back into that point. We'll never know. But that was crushing, and it was in the semis. And then Nadal beat him in the semis of the French that year. So yes, that wasn't as in 2006 was nothing like that. Only the loss in the finals to Nadal in Paris, which was more fitting that they'd play in the final. And then he won all the other 3, and pretty convincingly for the most part. A little shaky against Baghdadis in the Australian final, but overall he was just as impenetrable as I've ever seen him.
Yeah. Especially like if you consider 2 big losses to, I guess maybe 3 big losses to Nadal in that year. The Rome 2006, probably like the biggest one.
Yeah.
And to win in 4 sets against Nadal in the final in Wimbledon, his kind of like home court, which he would still own for another year. It must have felt really good for him.
Just to interrupt you, Nadal was thrilled to be in the final. Didn't really think he could beat him. It wasn't until the next year that he was. What's that?
I was just going to say, just losing to Rafa, I think 5 times in a row, heading into that Wimbledon final. Even though it was on grass and it was Nadal's first time and he beat Agassi along the way, I was going to say that he didn't really quite believe that he was up to the task that day. And he got bageled in the first set. And he managed to make competitive sets 2 and 3. But
yeah, he got a set later. You're right. He did not believe. And it was one thing to beat all the other guys, the Baghdadises and Andre's last Wimbledon, but he knew against Federer he's dealing with one of the great grass court players of all time. So he didn't, in his mind, he was not ready for that. But still, it still was a really solid performance from Federer. And that's really pretty much the way he played that whole year. I think he was supremely confident that year. And as you just alluded to, he was in the midst of this 4-year stretch. But although in 07, he was a lot less convincing in 07 than he was in 06. And he scraped by Nadal in the Wimbledon final. And Djokovic wasted 5 set points in the first set of the U.S. Open final and 2 more set points in the second set before losing in straight. But you could sense that Roger was now more vulnerable than he had been in the previous 3 years.
Definitely. And then, we get to 2008 and the mono starts. And
yeah, just to add what you were saying, it was a great effort to get pulverized by Nadal in the Roland Garros final, come back all the way from two sets to love to be within a couple of points of winning that Wimbledon final before losing at 9-7 in the fifth was a really gallant effort for Federer, who had won 5 in a row. He lost his title the right way. He made Nadal earn it in the end. And obviously, it was one of the great matches of all time, if not the greatest. Sorry. Go back, though. Finish your thought.
I was just going to refer back to the Rome final, because I think that match is one of the most important in the Federer-Nadal rivalry, given that it was the longest match they ever played. It was 5 hours and 5 minutes, and Rogers never won the Rome Masters, and he was twice a point away from doing it, and he ended up losing the set and 5-3 in the tiebreak. And
but he missed forehands on both match points, and his forehand, he didn't miss it much in those days. It was usually when he sensed an opening for a winner, he could make it, but he may have pressed a little in each case. And then, like you said, 5-3, and then at 5-3 in that tiebreak, he missed a cross-court forehand in the net tape, and he wasn't going actually even for a winner, but maybe a little bit tight there, and Nadal, won the next 3 points from there to complete it. Yeah, it was a very important match, because it might have given him the encouragement to, maybe he would have had enough confidence to get through the French final after winning the easy first set. But with that Rome match sort of looming in the back of his mind, lurking, I think it was very difficult for him once Nadal made his move in the second set. You're right. Rome was a critical match in that part of the rivalry. Then the next critical match in the rivalry would be from the opposite end of the spectrum, was Federer coming from 3-1 down on the fifth to defeat Nadal in the 2017 Australian final. Because if you look at that, he then beat him 3 more times that year. And, he'd already beaten him in 15. He eventually won 5 in a row and 6 of the last 7, including Wimbledon last year. So it's astounding what happened in that stretch, considering what Nadal had done against him up until then.
Yeah, it kind of feels almost like exorcising a ghost of Nadal, like looming over his head.
In the same stretch, Djokovic has been beating both of them, and so you can't. It's not as if Nadal's been winning majors in this period, and so it wasn't as if Nadal has gone into decline. But I think Federer had suddenly got in his head, and it was a role reversal, because for so long you sense that Roger was the one nagging doubts and going out there not sure he could do it. And suddenly by Wimbledon last year, you could sense that Nadal, even though he'd beaten Federer at the French for his only win against him over the last few years, you could sense that there was an apprehension on his part, and it showed a lot in the last couple of sets of that match.
A couple of things here is just to give, some credit to Federer as well for bouncing back from that Rome defeat and the French final defeat. And obviously he'd lost in Monte Carlo, and, the losses were piling up against Rafa. And even in 2006 and 7, I think he won 5 of the next 7 in that rivalry, because he did have a winning record in 2007. And he eventually did beat him on clay in Hamburg.
Yeah, that was I don't put much stock in that one, to be honest, because they were both exhausted. Nadal went down 6-11 the third, I believe, and he was just beat. And then he still came back and beat Roger handily in a comfortable 4-set French final. But no, I think Federer's attitude was always good. I don't think he was pessimistic, but I think he was, during those stages, he was just a bit confused. He would ask people like Darren Cahill, what do I do to beat this guy? He really wanted to figure out what he could do to turn it around. And of course, what eventually did it was the improvement in his backhand that we saw in 17. With the backhand was nowhere near as good back in 06, 07 as it was in 17 and 18.
Yeah, I guess one of the points is in maybe Federer all the way even through 04 to 07, maybe even like going through 05 to 07 even, is that Nadal is basically the one rival that people associate with Federer. But how dominant was him, like was Federer against his other rivals at the time? How much more comfortable was he playing against the Nalbandians and even
Well, the Nalbandian and Hewitt, they were trouble for him when he was younger. For the most part, he turned it around against all those guys. It really wasn't until we saw Djokovic come along. That's what changed everything. He suddenly had two serious rivals and not one. And Djokovic, is still, Roger had the upper hand against Novak for quite a while, say pre-2010, but it all turned. The last decade, it turned dramatically. But it was really not until Djokovic emerged, in my view, that Federer felt more. Until then, he was only worried about Rafa, period.
Yeah, and I think it's just interesting if you go back and you look at through these different stages of his career, because, I mean, we look at 98 to 2003 when, Federer, kind of came up and he idolized Sampras, and he was playing a more serve and volley type brand. He was, still trying to figure out and piece these ingredients of his game and, put it together and kind of blend them. And he was really having to work very hard to put that game together until you get to kind of 2003 when he wins the first Wimbledon in 2004. So how amazing is it that, both Djokovic and Federer kind of, for Djokovic it was 2005 to 2010, and for Federer it was 98 to 2003. But how amazing is it that Nadal, as soon as he came onto the tour, pretty much in 2003 and 4, already started to hit his prime and hit the ground running.
Oh yeah, it's true. He did. He hit the ground running. There's no two. He was the most mature of the three at a young age. Neither Roger nor Novak was nearly as mature as Nadal. If you compare them all as 19-year-olds.
Mm-hmm.
Vansh, do you have questions that you would like to ask as well, like in terms of that? And the 2006 even the season.
Yeah, I mean, I've often seen articles and pundits and analysts compare kind of 2006 Federer to a closer to another season like 2015 Djokovic, say, for instance. And people like to compare and see that Federer went 92-5 and he made 16 out of 17 finals, and obviously all the records. I mean, where do you think 2006 would rank in terms of certainly in the 2000s or in the Open era of all time?
Well, I so hard to gauge. I don't think I can put it there with McEnroe 84, and I'm not so sure I would put it there with Djokovic in 11 or 15. Maybe close. Slightly behind, because I don't think he was challenged as much. It takes nothing away to win 92 matches in a year. I mean, it is an astounding accomplishment, and to be in all four finals and lose only 5 matches and win the year end. I mean, it's certainly his signature year. Would I put it quite up there with some of the other? Maybe not. I certainly wouldn't put it with McEnroe, and I'm not sure about the two Djokovic years, because I think that the competition was a bit tougher. But it was he did everything that he could have possibly asked of himself and more. And it was no disgrace to lose the French final. And his standards were incredibly high that whole year. And that I think was the peak of his forehand. I don't think he's ever hit his forehand better than he did that year. Combination of being able to hit outright winners and not miss very much and just dominate matches with the serve setting up the forehand. I don't think he's ever done that more persuasively than he did in 06.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I have 2 questions, and they're kind of like related to each other. There's a lot of conversations, like especially if you go on Twitter and people just kind of wasting their time on social media on that saying that, say for example, Federer's prime was during a weak era. That's what I was trying to say. That I don't think you can really blame that on. It's not his fault. But that stretch from 04 to 07, aside from Rafa, and then Novak emerged in 07 and beat him in Canada and lost him the U.S. Open final. So he was now starting to make his move. But it was a period where Federer was able to fairly comfortably dominate the scene. And he wasn't, of course, pressed as much as he would be later. But go back to your point. Go ahead. Yeah, no, but it's just like a follow-up question. And after 2006, we see Nadal going to 5 sets in Wimbledon, and then post that, like 2008, a big change in the powers of tennis, if you will, of Nadal coming back to going to number one for the first time after 160 weeks at number two. And would you say that, and that kind of maybe goes to, would say both of you in a sense, 2006 Federer, is it a pivotal moment in tennis? Did that season raise the bar so that the Djokovic and Nadal would come in the scene and form the big three with the biggest winners of all time in the male circuit?
Well, that's hard to gauge that. It's really hard to gauge it. I mean, Federer brimming with confidence after the previous 2 years, for sure. Having done as well as he did in 04 and 05, and he now thought he could dominate the game. And he also knew that he didn't have too many threats out there. He really felt, aside from Rafa, who was now improving rapidly on the other surfaces and not just clay, but he certainly didn't think he was going to lose to him in that Wimbledon final. So it's hard to say. I think the more interesting year is 07, when Federer's still in all those major finals, but suddenly now he almost loses to Nadal in the Wimbledon final, and he manages to pull it, to play a great fifth set and wins it. And he struggles with Djokovic in the first set of the Open final, and again in the second. That could have been trouble, but the signs were there that things were starting to change, and it carried over into. So I find 07 to be the most interesting of those years, in the sense that Djokovic was now entering the conversation, and Nadal was that much better on the grass than he had been the year before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course, yeah.
A quick word though before we wrap up is I do want to pay homage to Nadal's 2008 season, and 2010. 2008 because he won the French again, so now he's winning his fourth French in a row. He goes on and wins his first Wimbledon in the epic over Federer, and then he wins the Olympic Games over the summer. Finally ran out of energy and lost to Andy Murray in the semis of the U.S. Open, but he made it to the top, got to number one, won 2 majors plus an Olympic gold. It was pretty remarkable. And then 2010, he won the last 3 majors of the year. He won the French. He got his title back, having lost to Soderling the year before. He won Wimbledon over Berdych, and then he wins the U.S. Open over Djokovic. I thought to win those 3 majors in a row and be clearly number one was an excellent campaign from Nadal as well.
Yeah, especially if you consider that I, for one, was one of those people that was thinking, like, maybe is Nadal ever going to win at the U.S. Open? And he does it so convincingly after winning 2 straight majors and then complete through the third at the U.S. Open. So that was a better, that couldn't be a better way to...
Yeah, exactly. And he'd had such disappointment in New York. The loss to Murray when he thought maybe he was ready to win. Not really that healthy in 09 when he got crushed by Del Potro in the semis. So he'd had some hard luck in New York, and he got injured against David Ferrer in 07 there. He and Blake had killed him, and Blake and Roddick had killed him in prior years. So he'd had a hard time, but gradual process of building up to it. So I think that 2010 Open was one of the most satisfying tournaments of his career, and it was the culmination of perhaps his finest season.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about Rafa, I think 3 seasons come to my mind. 2008, obviously that stretch that Steve just mentioned, from basically Hamburg, winning French, winning Queens, winning Wimbledon, winning Toronto, losing the semis in Cincinnati to Djokovic, and then coming back and beating him at the Olympics in the semis, and then beating Gonzalez, winning the gold. And then obviously you mentioned the U.S. Open. He was burned out by then.
He was burned, no doubt.
But then I think that was the prime stretch, best stretch of his career by far. And then you mentioned 2010, but I also think 2012 when he lost to Rosal in the second round at Wimbledon, and then he took those 6-7 months off and comes back and is a little slow to start off and loses a final to Zeballos in 2013 and skips the Australian, and then to manage and to come back and climb all the way to number one, winning 2 majors again and defeating Djokovic again for the last time on hard court.
Yeah, no, those were great wins. Not to mention that he beat Djokovic in that epic 5-setter in the semis at Roland Garros.
Right, yes.
No, I actually was best Novak has ever played him, even though he ended up beating him there once later, a couple of years later. That the match that he played against him in 13 was spectacular. And then Rafa then wins it over Ferrer and absolutely comes to New York, beats Djokovic again. That 13 was a great year, no doubt about it. Very, very rewarding year emotionally to come back and do that after what happened in 12. I agree.
Absolutely. And it was fascinating in the Djokovic and Nadal rivalry as well, when you think of the three best matches, the 2012 Australian final, the 2018 Wimbledon semifinal, and the 2013 French final. I thought it was very interesting how after the French Open win that Nadal had over Djokovic in 2013, he mentioned that, I should have won Australia and Novak should have won this.
Exactly. And that's classic. That's what makes him such a commendable guy, is that he's so honest that way. And to say that, as opposed to, I should have won them both, is that he realized that here's Novak up a break in that fifth set, on the verge of 5-3, 5-3, and trying to get to 5-3 in the fifth, and Rafa has escaped. Then that famous point when Djokovic touched the net. I mean, that was a heartbreaking loss for Djokovic, and so fair-minded of Nadal. And it reminded me of later that year, I'd done a book on the greatest tennis matches of all time, and Djokovic and Nadal, the cover was Djokovic and Nadal from their 2012 Australian final, because that match made the book just before we had to close the book. That match was played, and I got it in. And I gave it to Nadal at the 2013 Open because of that period that Andre just mentioned, where he hadn't been around. He took all that time off after the Rosol loss, so I hadn't seen Nadal. And I gave him the book, and he said, I showed him inside that I had ranked the match with Federer at number 1 on my list, and he said that was a great match. He said, but then he pointed to the cover. He said, but this was a great match too. I don't know any other great champion that would have said that about a match that they lost.
That he lost, yeah.
Wow.
But he was able to look at that, as he was able to look at the 2011 U.S. Open when he lost in 4, but be very proud of the one set that he took. And that carried him into the 12 Australian with a little more confidence, and he nearly beat him. Nadal, to me, is unique in that way, in that he can allude to what could have been a devastating loss for anybody else and say, yes, but that was a great match too.
Yeah, and I guess on that note, we guess you can start wrapping up. As going into Nadal, it's kind of it's a lot to. Nadal is a great champion, has always been. I've learned as a Djokovic fan to see him with different eyes as one of the greatest guys, and those guys are really the owners of amazing seasons, and I'm sure maybe hopefully 2021 is going to be a complete season, a full season, and hopefully they're still going to give us some nice matches to end up such a troublesome 2020, such difficult times. But yeah, this is all the time that we've got, and I would thank you so much, Steve, for being here with us, for bringing your wisdom and your knowledge in those seasons and your insight. Thank you, Vansh, for being here again, and all of your studying that you do, all of your interest for tennis is great. So yeah, thank you guys so much for being here with me today.
Well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed talking with both of you. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you so much as well from me, and it was a pleasure to finally speak with both you and Steve again. And I think we hit on a lot of great points, and I'm sure the listeners will really enjoy it. And I'm really looking forward to reading Steve's book.
Yeah, same. Speaking of which, just a reminder to people that Steve's book is coming in early September, and Steve's got some really, really great content in that book. Is Pete Sampras' Greatness Revisited, as I made a mistake in the first bit of this podcast, but it's revisited. And Sampras is one of my favorite of all time. And yeah, just be on the lookout to Steve's books coming out. I'm sure I'm going to get a copy for myself. So anything you want to add on your book, just to get people a little bit more excited about it, Steve?
Oh, I think they'll really enjoy a lot of things about it. His own reflections, Sampras' many reflections on his greatest triumphs, but also the observations of all the guys that he played against, like McEnroe and Lendl and Rafter and Edberg and Wielander and so many players. And then I got some very good things from Novak Djokovic about how much he idolized Sampras growing up and the way he's been inspired by getting to know him a little bit more in recent years and picking his brain. So I think tennis fans will really enjoy it because they'll be able to see the incredible reverence that these other players have for Pete, and they'll be able to get maybe a different view of Sampras as he's in his late 40s, looking back on the prime of his career.
All right, so that's all the time that we've got. Thank you guys again for being here, and follow me on social media. The descriptions are on the handles are on the description. So it'll be Vansh. And is there a link that I could add up for you, Steve? Something that you have on like a latest article or one of your books?
No, I think we're good.
Sure. Awesome. So yeah, thank you guys again. I'll be ending this here, and I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I'm going to have a lot of editing to do to make this a little bit shorter, but yeah, it was amazing, and looking forward to the next episodes. And yeah, have a great one, guys. Bye-bye.